Ooh. Yeah, dang goodness. You guys didn't say anything about how I look. You let me around looking like this all day. Ugh. Okay. So today we're going to talk about the four last things. I want you to write that at the top of your notes. The four last things. Those four last things are as follows. Number one is death. Number two is judgment. Number three, heaven. And number four is hell. Okay, so we're going to talk about the four last things. But first, I want to go over just a couple of things. Most importantly, what I call the action principle. So I want you to write this down as well. For every definitive statement or action, there necessitates a definitive response. It's kind of like for every action, there's a reaction, but a little bit deeper. Why? The reason that it's a little bit deeper is because it's all about your intention. So I want you to imagine that I were to, so I have my keys here, right? So I want you to imagine that I had these keys and I took it and I threw it to one of you students, okay? That's my definitive action. So if there's a definitive action, it necessitates a definitive response. So you have a couple of options. You can look at the keys coming and boom, let them hit your face. You can reach your hand out and catch them. You can look at them, realize you're not going to catch them in time, and then step to the side. You can do lots of different things. But the point is you can't just do nothing. You have to choose to do something. That's because it's a definitive action. It requires some kind of definitive response. So, when we talk about death, judgment, heaven, and hell, or the four last things, they have everything to do with your personal response to one person and one person only, and that person is Jesus of Nazareth. So when we talk about Jesus of Nazareth, we kind of have to start with who he is, right? That's the most important question, and especially that's the question that the Gospels are trying to ask. So let's start with John 14:6. This is what he says. Jesus says, I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father but by me. If he says, I'm the way, the truth, and the life, no one comes to the Father but by me, then what it means is exactly what it says. Jesus assumes that he's the only way to heaven. If you do not believe in Jesus, then it seems to us that the only way to get to heaven has now been taken away, because if Jesus is who he says he is, then his word is binding. And if you do not believe in Jesus Christ, well then, that's the way it goes. Remember, so here's Jesus' definitive statement or action. I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father except but by me. That requires a definitive response from you. So, when we talk about that, we go to John 8:58, and Jesus is conversing with the Jews, and this is his response. So they're having a conversation about whether or not Jesus is like possessed by a demon or is able to do these miracles because he's like possessed by a demon. And Jesus' response is no, and this is what they're saying. Are you greater than our father Abraham who died and the prophets who died? Who do you claim to be? Jesus answered, if I glorify myself, my glory is nothing. It is my Father who glorifies me, of whom you say that he is your God. But you have not known him. I know him. If I said I do not wish to know him, or I do not know him, I should be a liar like you. But I do know him, and I keep his word. Your father Abraham rejoiced that he was to see my day. He saw it and was glad. The Jews then said to him, you are not yet 50 years old, and you've seen Abraham? Jesus said to them, truly, truly, I say to you, before Abraham was, I am. Before Abraham was, I am. Now, the question is, where do we get this statement from? Because what you see is that immediately after Jesus finishes, they basically try to kill him again. So the question is, if all he said is, before Abraham was, I am, what's the thing that the Jews are so upset about that they would rather kill him than hear him out? Well, to understand what that is, we have to go back to Exodus 3:13. Exodus 3:13, Moses shows up, and he's having this conversation with God in the burning bush, and God says, let my people go, right? And Moses asked this question. He says, but Moses said to God, who am I that I should go to Pharaoh and bring the Israelites out of Egypt? And God said, I will be with you, and this will be the sign to you that it is I who have sent you. When you have brought the people out of Egypt, you will worship God on this mountain. That mountain is Sinai, by the way, the one that you guys always got wrong. Moses said to God, Suppose I go to the Israelites and I say to them, the God of your fathers has sent me to you, and they ask me, what is his name? And what shall I tell them? God said to Moses, I am who I am. This is what you are to say to the Israelites. I am has sent me to you. Now the reason that this is significant, I think, is because there's this old principle that says that when you have a name or when you name something, you have two things over it. You have authority and you have control over its essence. So I need you to write that down. When you name something, when you have something's name, you have authority over it, or when you give something a name, you have authority over it, and you, in a certain sense, have its essence. So if you think about it, your parents, they get to name you primarily because they have authority over you. When you come out kicking and screaming, they get to name you because they have authority. And when they give you your name, they also give you an identity to live by. And in so much as you give that name to other people, they have a kind of authority over your essence or your presence, if you want to think about it that way. So a prime example would be, if I'm walking down the hall and you guys say, hey, Mr. Gilbert, I don't just keep walking. When I hear my name, I stop because you have my name, in a certain sense, you have a kind of authority over my presence. When God gives his name, he's giving his name, but he's not giving his name. If you said to me, hey, what's your name? And I said, I am. Well, I'm not quite giving you a name, but here God is giving this phrase as the title that people can call him. But it's not just a title, it's a description almost of his essence, because God is what we call ipsum esse subsistens. He's not one thing among many, he is to be itself. All right? So you can't say like, well, what created God? No, nothing creates God. God is to be itself. He's existence itself, right? So if you talk about like, okay, if I were to ask you, well, I'm making a cheeseburger. What kind of ingredients do I need? You might say something like, well, you need, I now forgot what goes in a burger. You need meat, you need maybe cheese, you need tomatoes, lettuce. You might like to put something like mustard, ketchup, pickles, onions, little Whataburger sauce, who knows, whatever, right? And then if I were to say, oh, well, you need lettuce, pickles, God, you need cheese, you need tomatoes, you need all these other things, you would say, wait, what? What's that middle thing? And I said, oh, you need God. Well, no, you don't. Why? Because God is not one thing among many, but God is existence itself. It's ipsum esse subsistens. I'm going to spell that. I suggest you write it down. It's IPSUM ESE. And then subsistens is SUBSISTENS. Ipsum esse subsistens. That means the source of all being. He's to be itself. So God is goodness, justice, love, but all those things participate in him. Right? He's not just one thing among many in the universe. All those things participate in him. So when Jesus says, before Abraham was, I am, what he's claiming is, before Abraham even existed, I am ipsum esse subsistens. I am to be itself. That's how I know what Abraham was saying. Now, if we go back to John 14:6, Jesus says, I am the way, the truth, and the life. Why? Because he's ipsum esse subsistens. Now, because Jesus claims to be ipsum esse subsistens, we have an option. If Jesus claims to be God himself, ipsum esse subsistens, to be itself, then you either have one of three options. And those three options, as you know, are you're either the Lord, you're a liar, or you're a lunatic. Well, Jesus doesn't quite fit the description for a liar. We never see him lying. He can't be a liar. Jesus also isn't a lunatic. He doesn't demonstrate any of the things that we would normally associate with lunacy, like erratic behavior. We don't see him being erratic. We don't see him like being disconnected from the world. We don't see him like hallucinating pink elephants or things like that. In fact, every time he sees something that other people can't see, he pretty much proves that it's true what he's seeing, right? Which is not the same as lunacy. To be a lunatic is to be completely disconnected. So Jesus can't be that. Well, then the only possibility that we're really left with is that he is who he says he is. Now, if he is who he says he is, Remember, I said death, judgment, heaven, and hell are all about what you choose. Here is Jesus saying, I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father except by me. Well, if we use that action principle, whenever there's a definitive action or statement, it requires a definitive response. Death, judgment, heaven, and hell are all about your response. What is that you are choosing? That's the most important thing, I think. Okay? So, here's what I want you to do. I want you to write Roman numeral 1. Roman numeral 1. Because for every one of these 4 last things, we're going to have a way, a truth, and a life. So these are all going to be separate, different categories of how we discuss each of these things. So Roman numeral 1 is death. That's the first thing. Death. So Roman numeral 1, death. Now I want you to write under that way. Everything we're going to talk about is the way to death. Here's the way to death. Just kick it. You're going to die at some point. It's an unfortunate fact of life that we're all going to die. That's just the way it goes. Okay? If you have ever met somebody who's not going to die, I'd very much like to meet that person because they're an anomaly. But everybody, even God himself, when he became incarnate, died. Everybody dies. Sorry, that's the way it goes. That's the way to death. You just wait and you'll die eventually of something. Truth. So I want you to write, now this is the truth. So we have the way, the truth of death. What is the truth about death? The truth about death is that it's caused by sin. That's an unfortunate reality. The second truth about death is that it is what we might call unnaturally natural. It's unnaturally natural. I know that's a confusing way to state it, but it is true. It's unnaturally natural, and I'll explain. The last thing that you need to know about death is that it's actually quite beautiful. And again, that's contrary to the way that we usually think about things, but I'll explain what I mean. So the big question, how could a good and loving God let life terminate if it causes so much sadness? And the answer is, it's caused by sin. It's not so much God choosing to take somebody's life, though there can be an aspect of that. It's that the wages, so St. Paul says in Romans 6:23, the wages of sin is death. We chose death, or we should say our primordial mother and father chose death, and unfortunately that's a reality that we now have to deal with. The wages of sin are death. So the first sin really yielded for us